Do you know what is Tanzu? What's the meaning of the word? Let's do that.
No, actually, I have no idea. What's the meaning?
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a meaning. Tanzu is a branch in Swahili, and Tanzu represents the branch of the cloud native world out of VMware. So that's Tanzu. It's also a cabinet in Japanese, and it
Nice.
represents the different containers in a cabinet. So those
Oh,
are, yeah, that's the meaning of Tanzu. Um,
cool.
and Tanzu was born in VMware a long time ago.
Uh-huh.
As part of the different business units of VMware, we had a cloud native business unit. And then we've acquired a couple of companies that created Tanzu. And we acquired Heptio, that came with the two founders of Kubernetes, Greg McCluskey and Joe Beda. And then we acquired Bitnami, that are still part of our portfolio and represents the application catalog. We can talk about it later. And last but not least, Pivotal. So Pivotal is the one of the first application platforms that had
Mhm.
a cloud native and container workloads since 2013. And
Yeah.
Pivotal was the last piece of that Tanzu puzzle.
And Pivotal made Cloud Foundry. We're talking about the
Yes.
Cloud Foundry yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the infamous CF push
Yes.
experience.
Yes.
Yes.
And we should talk about like Cloud Foundry and Pivotal a bit more, because that's also the fundamental like value that we want to bring to our customers. And it's something that is, as I said, it's been around since 2013. We learn a lot. There are still tens of thousands of workloads running on Cloud Foundry as an application platform, and there's not a lot of difference in like the architecture, right? It's containers, it's running with an orchestration, it has a lot of components that we can also equivalent into the CNCF and Kubernetes. But that was the last piece of Tanzu. Eventually, we also merged with the cloud native, with the cloud management business unit in VMware. So we have a lot of those components of the cloud management as well. So that's Tanzu today. I think it's important to understand what's the origins of Tanzu. Tanzu has like two roots, right? One root
Mm-hmm.
is the Cloud Foundry root, and the other root
Mm-hmm.
is the CNCF and Kubernetes root. And that's
Mm-hmm.
important because when we will talk about the Tanzu platform, and we will, the Tanzu platform has also two roots, one in the Kubernetes stack and one in the Cloud Foundry stack. And what we are
Mm-hmm.
trying to solve, we are trying to solve to both roots, to both stacks. We're trying to bring that abstraction and experience and capabilities for Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes. Because if we will focus on the first line that you put on the like above that light board, which is our mission is to accelerate the application path to production. Production can
Mm-hmm.
be Cloud Foundry, it can be Kubernetes,
Mm-hmm.
it can be VMs, right? And we want
Mm-hmm.
to help our customers with that path, no matter what's the runtime, on cloud, on
Ah.
premise, on CF, on Kubernetes, doesn't really matter.
Are you is the experience, like the user experience, going to look and feel the same regardless of what infrastructure is running underneath?
Yeah, I think
That's cool.
that's the most important part. Like the last
Mm-hmm.
evolution of the Tanzu platform is exactly what you just mentioned, is to bring
Mm-hmm.
the same promise and the same experiences, the same way of creating that platform way of the path to production on on both stacks. So one of the and you also mentioned that one of the most famous things for from Pivotal days is the CF push experience.
Yeah.
I think we
We
need
should describe what that is.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think we should
Uh-huh.
double click on the CF push, because for people who doesn't really know, that's magic, and that's magic that developers really love. And the reason the developers love that, and not just developers, right? Like organization loves the CF push, is because when you have code, you don't have to specify a lot to then just CF push it. And when you do the CF push from your side as a developer, everything is being taken care of for you. So the code will
Mm-hmm.
be built, it will be transformed into an image, it will run as a workload, it will automatically get the networking plumbing and like security and logs and backup and
Regulation. Yeah.
regulations, and everything
Uh-huh.
will be managed for you. And eventually the other side you will have a workload that is running on your production environment or any other environment for that matter. Now, I think that's important. It's important to also say like what are the different steps, because when we talk about Kubernetes and we talk about the
Mm-hmm.
same experiences, that's what we want. So I think what
Mm-hmm.
we should do on the board right now is to put the steps, right? What are the steps from when I'm saying CF push, by the way, just for now, it's exactly
Mm-hmm.
as saying Tanzu deploy. Okay, so CF push and Tanzu
Okay.
deploy, exactly the same.
Should I just put maybe steps from code to
Yes,
production
yes,
instead of okay?
yeah. So let's start with a code. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the first thing. So we can start with code, and then the next step
Mm-hmm.
will be build.
Okay. So one code.
Right. The second will be build.
Self-explanatory. Build. And so by build, do we mean into a container image? Is
So
testing a part of building?
yeah, testing is part of building, and not just
Mm-hmm.
a container image, by the way. Like you can run that on
Okay.
VM as well. But for our
Okay.
conversation today, because we will talk a lot about Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry with the container, with containers and Diego cells, yes, let's talk about also images. On that build,
Okay.
when you talk about container images, there are a couple of builds. So if you think about like traditional code, when you're building the code, you have binary. Then you can run that on any operating system or an operating system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to build an image, you need to add to this binary infrastructure dependencies that will be part of that container image that will allow
Mm.
that binary to run. So application runtime, application dependencies, operating system, and everything is being squashed into like a container image that then you can use. That's also where I think it's important to talk about OCI images, which is basically an open container image that allows you to run. It's a standard that allows you to then run it on different runtimes exactly in the same way.
So we're going to say build into OCI artifact,
Oh yeah, OCI image artifact. Yep.
and we'll say image open container initiative is
Well,
OCI,
yeah,
right? OCI image. So this includes testing, but this also includes infrastructure considerations.
right. So from the code side, you will have the different dependencies that you need for the code. You will have tests that is built in. You will have now you're including all the infrastructure layers, let's say certificates or TLS that you need, or I don't know, other things that you will need as part of that code to run it.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically forms your image. Now we can also, again, we can start by double clicking also on each and every one of those pieces. A build
Mm-hmm.
is super critical piece, because one of the things that you see in customer environments is that they don't have consistency in the build. They're using manual build process, or even if it's automatic, they're using different build processes for different
Oh.
languages. And again, we've started by talking about how important consistency is, right?
Uh-huh.
Consistency
Yeah.
for that is super critical. So if let's take the easiest like example, which is always security, right? If you have consistency in the way that you're building things and you're using always the same operating system and always the
Mm-hmm.
same dependencies, which are always the latest, not something which is outdated, not something that may have been already vulnerable with something, you will always gonna get like the most secured image that you can.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that is super important about the build is to make sure that you're using a build engine, something that can
Mm-hmm.
get like always iterate and change based on the latest dependencies, on the latest base OS, on the latest everything, and will create
Mm-hmm.
revisions for your builds. That's where we are using buildpacks.io as an open source
Mm-hmm.
project as part of our stack. And by the way, it's being used on the Kubernetes side and on the Cloud Foundry side. Doesn't really matter.
Love
So
it.
yeah, we help with that build service, and I think the build service is super important. There's a lot of challenges that we've talked about that is automatically
Mm-hmm.
correlates into the build challenges.
Uh, Tanzu uses build packs as a build service for secure, reproducible builds.
For everything. So it's
Okay,
right.
I'll
It
just
is
leave it at that.
secured. It is secured and reproducible. But the way that build service works, and by the way, that's build pack, so it's open source. You
Consistent.
can use that. It's basically when something changed, either if like the dependency change or the code change, build service automatically will pick up that change and create a new revision. Now, when you have a platform that manage everything from the code to production, you can think about that platform that has like now the knowledge, there's a new revision, and you're not running it. You're running something in
Mhm.
production which is not the latest revision because build service just created a new revision. And now the platform can say, okay, I have a new revision. Do you want to roll that into production? If you want to do that with a canary upgrade, and so on and so forth, like in a way that
Mhm.
will not disturb anyone else, but you will get the latest version, which has less vulnerabilities and has less even operational like gaps, right? It can have
Mhm.
be also operational, not just security. So that's the build service, and that's a I think it's a fundamental pillar in our strategy. When we will get into like eventually the map of the build, bind, deploy, build is significant.
There are a lot of considerations here, and yeah, consistency across the organization
Consistency
is
is the
exactly the yeah, it's the key to everything.
yeah.
So first code, then build. Did you just say bind?
Yeah. So you build that image and you
Uh
have
huh.
that now running on, not running even, you have that in your image registry and you want to push it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do deploy before the bind because
Okay.
we will get into the bind, but the next step after you build that is you
Mm-hmm.
want to deploy that on a runtime. So it's an OCI
Mm-hmm.
image. That means that I can then deploy that on even just a Docker host, or I can run that on Kubernetes, or I can use any uh, abstraction that has like a container engine. It can be container D or
Mm-hmm.
anything else, not just Docker. But how do I run that image with the right configuration and the right set of parameters based on best practices or anything else? Like I need to create some kind of a manifest that describes how do you
Mm-hmm.
run this code against
Mm-hmm.
the runtime that you need to run it on. On Kubernetes,
Mm-hmm.
I will have to describe, I don't know, let's say, what's the port that I'm exposing? What's the name of that container image? What are the environment variables, if I have any that I need to specify? What are the health checks or, I don't know, resource quota limitations or other things, right? There's a lot of things that you need to configure as part of that deployment process. And that's where the same build service on the Tanzu side also prepares that manifest. So when we are creating
Mm-hmm.
the build, we are not just creating the build, we are creating the build and we are preparing that image for deployment.
So there's a lot of so when you deploy an image, that comes with a lot of configuration around that image. Like we
Right.
need to say like where it's going and maybe how many copies or the maximum number of copies, the how many resources. We need to connect it to environment variables, service credentials, ports. There's a lot to think about.
Right.
And so are you saying that Tanzu generates that
Yes.
configuration?
Yeah.
Well,
As part of the build, when you configure that build
mhm,
service, one of
mhm,
the things you configure is you basically tell the build service what is the runtime that you want to run on. And you can
uh-huh,
specify if it's Kubernetes or if it's Docker or if what is it. And then the same
uh-huh.
build process will also create a manifest to deploy. You should ask, how does build service knows what I need in my organization, right?
That's exactly what I was gonna ask.
Like
That's
what, what,
that's what wheels are
what,
turning about.
what kind of black magic is this? But
Yeah.
basically what it does is it uses best practices and conventions. So One of the
Uh-huh.
things that we also have in our Tanzu portfolio and in our Tanzu world is that we
Mm-hmm.
are tightly coupled into Spring. So Spring is part of Tanzu, and
Mm-hmm.
it's been since day one for the last 20 years. And when
Mm-hmm.
we create those, and let's just take an example of Spring because it's easy. If you have a Spring code that you want to build, and you use the build service, one of the steps will be to add Spring Boot conventions to that file. So
Mm-hmm.
health checks and graceful shutdowns and other things that we know, we as Spring, we know you need that as part of your running application. And on
Mm-hmm.
the basic level of things, you will have to specify beforehand what's the port that you expose for that image, because that's something that can change between organizations. So some of the things will be in the fundamental configuration of the build service, and some of the things will be added as best practices and things we know you should have as part of that manifest. But either way, we do that and we create that manifest for you, and we even package that as a Carvel package. So we can talk about Carvel as an open source, or I guess you had multiple sessions on Carvel. But one of the things that we also do is we are packaging that as a Carvel package that you can then deploy to a runtime.
Okay. So Tanzu generates the configuration partly best based on best practices. So best practices for whatever particular language you're using.
Yes, not just
For
Spring.
example, Spring, it knows
Yeah.
the best practices for that. Presumably, it knows best practices for whatever where you're deploying to, like whatever infrastructure you're going to run on.
It, that's not as important, because as long as it, let's take Kubernetes as an example, right? And
Okay.
upstream Kubernetes or vanilla Kubernetes is exactly the same across any infrastructure provider. EKS,
Okay. Yeah.
AKS, EKE,
Mm-hmm.
Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, it's the same Kubernetes, so it's not gonna change. So that's,
Okay.
it's not based, it's based on the way that you want to run it, not based on where do you want to run it, right? There's a
Okay.
difference between a Docker file and a Kubernetes manifest. There's no
Yeah.
difference between Kubernetes manifest to Azure and a Kubernetes manifest to AWS.
Got you, got you. What if, for whatever reason, my app is special and I needed to have some special configuration that's not that's outside of what's best practices? Can I do manipulate that?
Yeah, of course. You can change the configuration file as much as you want. By the way, you can also create your own builder. So if you want to have, like, if you have constraints on the way that you want to build and you don't want to take the out of the box one, you want to use specific versions, you want to use specific OS or specific, you can do that as well. Everything
I
is
love that.
modular and open.
I love that. So the manifest is created, Tanzu generates it according to best practices, and then here's a question. Like maybe there's some specific best practices across the org. Can those get incorporated in?
No, but that's exactly the point. So if we go back into like what we want to achieve is that abstraction. The developer should,
Mm-hmm.
should only do the CF push, right? It only
Mm-hmm.
needs to do one command. Doesn't need to think about anything else. Now,
Mm-hmm.
on the way that we structure it in Tanzu is that we have projects, and those projects are usually a development team or a business line or whatever the way that you structure your organization. But that
Mm-hmm.
project has a set of configuration that is dedicated for the
Mm-hmm.
project, and it can be totally
Okay.
different from a different project. Like one project can
Nice.
have configuration for a specific build in a specific way with an output of Docker because they need to run on Docker, and another one can have other builds running on Kubernetes with Carvel or whatever, right? So there's,
Uh-huh.
according to those projects, you can decide what are the configuration for the developer. And I think that's the most important thing is what you just mentioned about the developer side, which eventually from the developer side, he doesn't have to think about it. He doesn't have to think about anything, by the way. The only thing he needs to do is to commit the code and do the Tanzu deploy. The Tanzu deploy command, which equals to the CF push command, does the build and deploy of that code into the runtime that is configured as part of that manifest configuration.
Cool. I just made an assumption that I want to verify. The app and config gets packaged together, and I imagine that's versioned as a Carvel package.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, everything is
It
versioned.
feels like, of course,
Yeah.
but I just want to verify
Yeah.
because I didn't know for sure. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so far in open source, we've talked about build packs and Carvel.
Now we've mentioned deploy as the third bullet, but we've talked about creating the configuration for the deployment. We haven't talked about like the actual deploy.
Actual deployment.